Hello, I'm Terry Young. Welcome to another edition of Reasonable Discourse. I'm here with my colleague, Shawn McAvoy. Shawn, last year we had a discussion about political gridlock in Washington, D.C., and here we are several months later, and once again going through the same process. We're in the midst of a government shutdown. So tell our viewers, what's going on in Washington, if anything?
What's going on in Washington? Well, they'll be happy to note the congressional gyms are still open.
That's
at least still going on, and the subway under the Capitol building, from the parking lot to the building, but not a lot else. The government has gone, as you've mentioned, into a shutdown over a dispute over a continuing resolution. Should we continue to fund the government, and specifically the Affordable Care Act, which goes into effect as of the 1st of October, or not? The Senate and the House are fighting over it, and in the meantime, a lot of people have no jobs at the moment.
We have been in the shutdown for a little while now. This is not something that's unique historically as far as the shutdown goes. Can you give us a little background about when we've gone through this before?
We have had, this is our 18th shutdown since 1976, which is amazing when you think about it. However, until 1981, the shutdowns did not close major federal agencies.
Okay.
Due to interpretations of the law that were pretty lax. The Attorney General in 1981 issued a new opinion that when a shutdown occurs, major government offices do have to close, and that's when we started to begin seeing things like Social Security quit paying out checks and CIA and whatnot shutting down temporarily.
And so we somehow managed to go, I think it was about 17 years in between shutdowns. I think some of us will recall, those viewers who are old enough may remember what happened in the 1990s that with Newt Gingrich leading the Republican House and Bill Clinton as the Democrat in the White House. Now we have John Boehner as the Speaker of the House, another Republican, and then once again we have a Democrat in the White House and Barack Obama. Do you see any parallels between the two, or do you think there's something different about this shutdown?
No, I think, in my opinion, the shutdown is different from the one in the 90s. The one in the 90s seemed to have a great deal to do with the personalities involved. And from my take at the time, it was very much a war between President Clinton and Speaker Gingrich. Now, although President Obama and Speaker Boehner are the main figures, it doesn't seem to be a personal war between those two, but actually a fight. More of an ideological fight going on.
It seems like in the 1990s that Newt Gingrich was firmly in control of the Republican Party. He had directed their contract with America, which brought them historic success in the 1994 congressional election. I think some people would question, or I think they wouldn't doubt the fact that John Boehner doesn't have that kind of control of the Republican party at this point. What's going on within that party that may be putting pressure on John Boehner to act the way he has in the course of this shutdown?
A bifurcation of the party and a struggle for control that's been going on for some years now. You actually do have two well-defined wings of the Republican Party. The so-called Tea Party group, which is probably better characterized as the far right, since not everyone there is a Tea Partier, and the moderate wing of the party, which has lost a lot of credibility since the 2000 elections. And so what you have is Boehner, who is usually a moderate, but he loves his position as Speaker, and if he wants to keep it, he's going to pay attention to the wing of the party that's making more noise at the moment.
Now, you mentioned one of I guess the primary issue or dispute, as it's being framed anyway, I think on the Republican side, is their concern about the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. But maybe you can kind of frame this for our viewers. Is this really something that we've seen previously from a historical precedent standpoint where a president has been asked to basically modify legislation that has survived one presidential election and two congressional elections and even a challenge in the U.S. Supreme Court? Have you seen anything like this before?
Not that plays out this particular way. The closest analog I can think of is the Social Security Act under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when Social Security was a major toxin of the Republican Party. They wanted to kill it. And it did go through several court cases. It went through multiple elections. It still survived. But in that day, they weren't using government shutdowns the way they did now. And I wanted to ask you a question.
Sure.
Since we're discussing the heart of this, or the shutdown, the heart of this is that continuing resolution. Now, I was curious if you could explain for our viewers exactly what is a continuing resolution and why it's important at the moment.
Well, there needs to be some sort of agreement to fund the government in order for the government to function, and that's this continuing resolution would be an agreement between the House and the Senate to provide for the funding for the government, and they have to agree to that. If we do not have a long-term budget in place, which we've not been able to achieve in a number of years, that makes it necessary. And one of the things that I found interesting recently was the revelation, I guess, by John Boehner in an ABC News interview with former Clinton advisor George Stephanopoulos, that he had actually reached an agreement this summer with Harry Reid and Senate Democrats basically to resolve differences between their proposed budgets. The Senate Democrats had agreed to reduce their budget by about $70 to $80 billion, and John Boehner had agreed to do that. But apparently, when word got back to certain members of the Republican Party in the House, and you talked about the different factions, the more conservative faction, that was not acceptable, and I think they thought, well, here's another chance to try to undo the Affordable Care Act. I guess what surprises me, though, you mentioned the Social Security Act, but I can't recall a situation where any president, has given up on, I guess, what would be considered perhaps centerpiece legislation of his first term, especially when his own party controls one of the chambers in Congress. So when I hear the Republicans talking about the idea of negotiating, I think in reality John Boehner knows that there is going to be no negotiation about Affordable Care Act. I think that the possibility of that happening ended in the 2010 election when the Democrats retained control of the U.S. Senate, and then in the 2012 presidential election when Barack Obama was reelected. So that, to me, makes this a very unusual situation that we have.
It's unusual, but I give some credit to Boehner and his group in as much as you know, politics is to a great extent perception, not facts. Whether or not it is possible to negotiate or whether negotiations are dead isn't the point. They can continue to demand negotiations, and if they know for a fact they can't happen, there are still going to be many people who say, well, they asked for good faith negotiations and didn't get them. It then allows Boehner and his group to portray their opposition in an unfavorable light, and in politics it's often all you need.
Well, we've already seen during this government shutdown, Wall Street had a quote from an Obama administration official who said that we're winning this shutdown. There was a local television crew in Kentucky that, with a hot mic, that caught a little bit of a conversation between Rand Paul and Mitch McConnell talking about what they need to do to win this shutdown. So tell me, who is winning the shutdown? We know who the losers are. It seems to be the American people, but can anyone possibly win this politically?
Can they win politically? Again, it's perception. I don't know about nationwide. I know that, at least in our community, I've been seeing that more people than not are backing Boehner and the Republicans. It would seem that, at least in our area, they are scoring points. The longer they keep the government shut down, the more popular they become.
And it seems like that. I think whether you're talking about Obama and the Senate Democrats or Boehner and the House Republicans, they are playing to their supporters, not to the middle group in America who may be referred to as independents. They're certainly not going to win brownie points with people across the aisle, so to speak, or people who voted for the opposing party. It seems more they are trying to, again, solidify that support from their core constituency who shares the same political views anyway. If that's the case, who's going to help bring about some sort of compromise in this? if Democrats don't want to give in about the Affordable Care Act, which again would seem unlikely as sort of unprecedented historically, and the more conservative Republicans in the House don't want to say we surrender. I mean, that's sort of the message we got that from John Boehner. He agreed to that compromise, but now to do so would be considered surrender, and you can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
So who's going to help bring about a resolution to this? Is it going to be just public disgust and pressure, or is there a political group within Congress that can help bring this about?
Oh, there are moderates within Congress in both parties who could bring about some sort of compromise, no doubt. Do they have the will to do it? And one other problem is, while we're talking reasonably and having a nice discourse about moderation and trying to bring this to a close, I think one question we have to consider is, are there people who don't want it to stop? Maybe resolution is not in the cards. Some people want this to continue as long as possible to cause the maximum damage. We still have a skosh over a year until the next congressional election. And at this point, it's really impossible to tell which one of the sides is going to be hurt most, if either at all, out of this situation. They may want to just dig in their heels, cause more damage, and see who's going to take the hits harder come Election Day.
Well, Shawn, that scares me. You're telling us that we should be cynical about our politicians. I don't understand that. But anyway, the next thing that is coming up is concern about whether or not the U.S., the Congress will agree to raise the debt ceiling so that we can increase the amount of debt that we have as a country. And before we get into the discussion about the debt ceiling, I think some Republicans would say, beyond the issue with the Affordable Care Act, that one of the things they hope or want to accomplish is in some way that we start to reduce the debt. We've had some debt reduction during the summertime after the sequestration occurred. June was a good month in regards to that for the U.S. government. But do you see what some people have called the grand bargain happening, coming out of all this ugliness? Is there some chance that Speaker Boehner and President Obama and any other parties that need to be involved can come up with some sort of bargain where we start to see the U.S. go on the path that it really needs to as far as debt reduction goes?
Again, can it be done? Yes. Is there a political reason to do it? Well, that's the problem. As long as both sides can blame the other and get votes for it, it's difficult to see where this is going to wind up. But that brings us back to something you had said earlier. Both sides seem to be playing to their base.
Right.
The independents seem to be completely lost in the equation. So my question would be, actually, is there any way for independents and moderates on either side to come out and make their voice heard?
And you know, politically, that's a challenge for the more moderate voices in the Democratic and Republican Party, because especially in House elections, they're going to be the individuals who are most vulnerable to being voted out, because they tend to be in districts where there are closer elections, districts that you can't necessarily call conservative or liberal, somewhere in the middle. And even though they may be more likely to be the voices of reason, they may very well be the first guys who get kicked out if people are upset at Congress. So they may be limited in what they can do. They're probably scared for their political lives at the moment.
Which brings us to a disturbing question that's worth asking. Have we gotten to a point in the Republic where moderation is a losing battle?
That's a good question. And I think as we look at the government shutdown issue, and you said that some folks may feel like they benefit from it being dragged out, some of the things that you're hearing from commentators is, look, people said that the world would end if sequestration occurred, and a lot of people haven't felt the effects of that. Then people said if we have this government shutdown, we're going to have all sorts of problems. Now, we'll talk in a little bit about those people who have felt the effects of the shutdown, but a lot of people have not. So now with the looming showdown over the debt ceiling, some people are saying, well, that wouldn't necessarily be that bad because you've been warning us about these other things, and what have really been the consequences of those things? So Is that something we should worry about, that we haven't been hit hard enough yet, that we'll keep pushing the lines out there?
I think it's something to be very concerned about. We have, to a great extent, been inured from some of the worst effects of, frankly, some of our own short-sightedness. It's interesting to me to see the arguments, as you've said, some on both sides actually, discussing, well, you know, this isn't really going to be so bad. If we go over the debt ceiling, we're still collecting taxes. We still are actually functioning. Yet on Wall Street, as of really yesterday and today, short-term Treasury bonds are being sold off in bulk. 1 month Treasury bonds are just being dumped on the market. They're going to pay out after the things are triggered if we don't fix the debt situation. And investors have no confidence in the U.S. government.
Right. And I think, we have heard, I know there were a number of Republican senators yesterday, Orrin Hatch among those, Tom Coburn from Oklahoma, saying that we're really not sure it's that big a deal. Yet a lot of folks who were around Wall Street when we had the financial collapse in 2008 are saying, if this happens, what happened in 2008 will be nothing compared to what happens if it's the U.S. government that's in default. And we got to think about the things that are tied up in U.S. debt, like the Social Security Trust, lots of pension funds. And there's so much interconnectivity in international finance that it's not just the U.S. that's going to suffer significantly if this happens, because there will be a destruction of confidence. There's all sorts of legal things that will be triggered by this. I hope we don't find out. I'm afraid some people are underselling what could happen with this if we don't raise the debt ceiling, but I guess we'll see here pretty soon.
We'll find out. In a way, it's already started with the shutdown without even getting to the debt ceiling. Most people may remember, or maybe they've forgotten, we were on the verge of starting another Mideastern adventure in Syria, with the U.S. forces bombing in that country. We had an alliance built of Turkey, Israel, and Jordan. The last minute we backed out, leaving them high and dry and leaving Israel furious. But now with the shutdown, even if we wanted to go back into Syria, we can't do it. So that's left the door open for really Russia to come in with whatever solution Moscow wants. So our foreign policy's already been hit hard by the shutdown alone. You bring in the budget, which then takes down our military readiness and reduces the staff at our bases, makes it even worse.
Well, some say the sequestration actually was, really a lot of it was directed at military. So I think there are a lot of questions about our level of defensive readiness, I guess, at this point, and certainly that's an issue. So not even getting into the economic questions, we have other issues. We mentioned that some people have been hit hard by the government shutdown. Who's suffering under the shutdown?
Reservists. Many reservists are not being allowed to drill any longer in our military reserves. Civilian staff on military bases have been furloughed. 800,000 people around Washington area. Apparently Virginia and Maryland are really nervous for the local economy since we're so dependent on the government, which isn't currently functioning at the moment.
Sure.
The CIA had to actually send much of its staff home. I saw a report that as of this morning, they've started to recall their staff in violation of their orders because they simply can't function
without. Yeah, I think there's 300,000 DoD, Department of Defense workers who were recalled. Mm-hmm. Yesterday there was a report about family members of those service personnel who've been killed in Afghanistan this month not receiving death benefits because of the shutdown, and that sparked a lot of outrage and discussion in both houses of Congress yesterday. And it's not just the government employees. I mean, we have to think about, locally, what's going on in the Parkway. Think about those folks who have businesses that are dependent on traffic. So it's not just the government employees that suffer, but it's a lot of those collateral businesses that are dependent on people basically availing themselves of these things like the Blue Ridge Parkway and various national parks and things like that. All the hotel owners and restaurant owners, all of those folks are going to suffer significantly as well.
And the local communities, especially if we go beyond the debt deadline, you're going to start seeing, we've already started having reductions, of course, since the sequester and food stamps. People who are reliant on those may see those dry up completely. There's going to be, of course, a question on Social Security. If we go in this sequestration, this shutdown for too long, and then add the debt problem on top of it, you can see Social Security checks no longer flowing out to the elderly. So it's going to start impacting the least among us. If it hasn't already started, it will very soon.
Sure. And so while some things folks who do not receive certain government services may not be attentive to, when you start talking about Social Security, I think everyone will hear about that. That will certainly be an issue.
They vote. The Gray Panthers vote, and they vote when they're angry.
Let me ask you this. Why, as we see this happening, becoming much more commonplace in the last few years, where we have these threats of shutdowns and it actually happens, or where we have this battle up until the very deadline of when we can raise the debt ceiling, it sort of reminds me of, you know, having a married couple deciding that they won't talk until someone files for divorce. You know, is there some way out of this? I mean, can you see a change in political attitudes or structure that would lead politicians to try to have good faith negotiations and long-term plans in place before we get to these deadlines? Because it seems like a lot of stuff is done out of desperation when we get to this point.
Difficult to say. People are making out very well. This system, what many people see as a broken system, like you said, getting to deadlines, doing things out of panic, it works. Many people benefit from this. Granted, it's usually those who are in the political class, but the fact is it does work. So it's difficult to see us ever getting out of this habit, at least in this generation.
Let's go into, I guess, the apocalyptic mode here. Let's say that that we don't raise the debt ceiling, that the worst case scenario occurs, we go into another recession, or perhaps even a depression, who knows, but something that's worse than what we experienced beginning in 2008. What do you foresee as being the political consequences of that kind of disaster? I mean, we already see so much frustration with both parties and what's going on in Washington, D.C. If we basically shoot ourselves in the foot and end up in this very uncertain and difficult economic situation, one that I think everyone would say could easily have been avoided, what are the political repercussions to that?
Political repercussions. That's a difficult one because to an extent I think we've already started down that road with other things, that this is more a consequence of things we've done previously than it is a cause of what is to come. We've already, quite honestly, since Obama's been in office, found significant resistance among some state governments to cooperate with the federal government at all, almost entirely because of Obama's ideas. The Affordable Care Act not being the only thing, but it's certainly one of the major elements that has some states, Arizona where I used to live being one of them, already discussing nullification laws, actually having elements of state government that would go through federal law and just declare the ones they don't like to be invalid. Texas and a few other states still about 2 or 3 times a year keep bringing up secession.
Yeah,
so I'm not sure that the debt itself is going to trigger a problem.
Okay.
I think we're in the 1850s already.
Yeah, maybe people forgot about that Civil War thing, that little skirmish that we had in America from 1861 to 1865. I guess what I was thinking about, you know, if there's so much, we talked about each party trying to win the shutdown. I mean, if we have an economic disaster that comes out of something that seems to be avoidable, are we talking about the potential destruction of the current two-party system that we have? I mean, do you see where people would say, look, I've had it with Democrats, I've had it with Republicans, and I want something else? Do you see something like that?
Oh, as to the party system, yeah, the current party system, but I think part of what's going on now is that it's already falling apart. The fact that the Republicans are bifurcating, I would argue, into 2 very distinct wings already portends that there's a change coming in the political system. Now, I'm not sure that that necessarily means we're going to have a third party. We don't tend to like that in America. Mm-hmm. But when you look at the Democrats, there's even less cohesion in the Democrats now than there usually is, and usually there's not that much.
Right.
So it almost looks like you could foresee a situation where a new party system arises that's essentially based on what we'd call moderate Republicans and far-right Republicans. And then that's around where everything will coalesce in the next party system.
Yeah, I was wondering who might step into the void, something in the center to try to...
Centers are not usually our strong point in American history.
It has not been. Right, you're correct, you're correct. Well, folks, we appreciate you joining us as we discuss some of these very complex issues, and we'll have to see what happens over the next few weeks, because I think we may have to get back together and have more discussions once we see the consequences of all the folly in Washington. Hopefully things will be resolved, but we'll have to see if that turns out to be the case.
Trust us, ladies and gentlemen, we can keep coming back and talking about it until the government reopens.
Thanks a lot. We'll see you soon.
Have a good evening.